year 6500 before Christ. On an arid plain between two wild rivers, a group of nomads makes the most transcendental decision in human history: to stop moving. They don't know it yet, but this simple act of staying, of planting seeds instead of following herds, will trigger a revolution that will forever transform the destiny of our species. Welcome to Mesopotamia, the place where it all began. Mesopotamia. The name resonates in our ears with the weight of millennia. But what does it really mean? In ancient Greek, the word translates literally as land between rivers, a precise geographical description of the region that stretches between the courses of the Tigris and Euphrates, two streams of water that serpentined through what we know today as Iraq, Kuwait, and fragments of Iran and Syria. However, reducing Mesopotamia to a simple geographical location would be like describing the ocean solely by its salt. This land, blessed and punished by its rivers, would become the stage where humanity would take its first steps toward something completely new, something that had never existed before: civilization. But let's stop for a moment. Why precisely here? What did this region have that other lands inhabited by humans at that time didn't have? The answer lies in an almost magical combination of geography, climate, and natural resources. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, born in the mountains of Anatolia, descended southward, dragging with them sediments rich in nutrients that they deposited year after year on the alluvial plains. These annual floods, though unpredictable and sometimes devastating, created soils of extraordinary fertility, capable of feeding increasingly numerous populations. The climate, more humid in the north and progressively more arid towards the south, offered different ecological niches where they could experiment with varied crops. And perhaps most importantly, the absence of large forests facilitated the conversion of wild lands into cultivable fields, while the scarcity of stone and wood would force inhabitants to develop ingenious technologies based on the most abundant resource of all: mud. Let's now travel to the year 6500 before Christ, to an era that archaeologists call the Neolithic period, when the first rays of civilization's dawn were barely beginning to illuminate the horizon. In the lands of northern Mesopotamia, where rains fell with relative regularity, small groups of people made a revolutionary decision: to abandon the nomadic life of hunters and gatherers that their ancestors had practiced for tens of thousands of years. These pioneers built the first permanent villages, modest structures of adobe and reed that would mark the beginning of an unprecedented transformation. The names of these first settlements resonate today only in academic circles: Bukras, Umdabagia, Yarim Tepe. They were humble places, with populations that rarely exceeded a few hundred inhabitants, but they represented something radically new in human experience. For the first time, people remained in the same place throughout their entire lives, generation after generation. They built houses meant to last, stored food for winter, and most importantly, they cultivated the land. The agriculture practiced by these first Mesopotamians was rudimentary, dependent on seasonal rains, and limited to small parcels of land. They cultivated mainly wild cereals that they gradually domesticated: wheat, barley, and some legumes like lentils. Each season represented an experiment, a slow and laborious learning process about when to plant, how to store seeds, which plots gave better harvests. There were no manuals, no written traditions. All knowledge was transmitted orally from parents to children, in a process as slow as it was inevitable. But here comes something fascinating. These first communities not only cultivated plants, they also raised animals. Sheep and goats were the first domesticated species, followed later by pigs and cattle. This control over food resources generated something that had never before existed in human history: predictable surpluses. It was no longer necessary for every member of the community to dedicate all their time to the search for food. The first forms of specialization emerged. Some could dedicate themselves to making stone tools, others to pottery, others to building dwellings. The seeds of social complexity had been planted. We now advance to the year 5600 before Christ, when what archaeologists call the Hassuna-Samara culture emerges. This period marks a qualitative leap in the sophistication of Mesopotamian communities. Settlements grow in size and complexity, houses are built with more advanced techniques, and something truly remarkable appears: decorated ceramics. The potters of Hassuna-Samara were not content with producing simple utilitarian vessels. They decorated their works with elaborate geometric patterns, with stylized representations of animals and plants. Why does this matter? Because decorated ceramics require time, specialized skill, and crucially, a society with sufficient food surpluses to allow some of its members to dedicate themselves to activities not directly related to immediate survival. Simultaneously, in regions slightly farther north, another culture flourished that would leave an indelible mark on Mesopotamian prehistory: the Halaf culture, which extended approximately from the year 5600 to 4000 before Christ. Halaf artisans took ceramics to levels of technical and aesthetic refinement without precedent. Their works, characterized by polychrome designs of extraordinary complexity, have been found in sites scattered along hundreds of kilometers, suggesting extensive commercial networks. Imagine for a moment what this means. Products manufactured in one place traveled enormous distances for the era, passing from hand to hand, from community to community. The first exchange networks were being established that would eventually evolve into complex commercial systems. But the true revolution, the moment when Mesopotamia began its unstoppable ascent toward urban civilization, arrived with the Ubaid period, which developed approximately between the years 5500 and 4000 before Christ. This phase represents an absolutely crucial turning point, and to understand its importance, we need to comprehend a fundamental change in the relationship between humans and their environment. Until that moment, Mesopotamian agriculture had depended mainly on natural rains, which limited cultivable zones to the northern regions where precipitation was sufficient. The lands of the south, the alluvial plain near the Persian Gulf, remained largely uninhabited, arid, flat, apparently inhospitable. But the Ubaid peoples looked at these barren lands and saw potential. They observed that, although rains were scarce, water from the rivers flowed abundantly. Why not bring that water to the fields? Thus, irrigation agriculture was born, a technological innovation whose impact on human history is difficult to exaggerate. The inhabitants of the Ubaid period excavated the first irrigation canals, carefully designed systems that diverted water from the rivers to previously sterile fields. Suddenly, vast extensions of land became cultivable. Agricultural productivity multiplied exponentially. Food surpluses grew dramatically, and with more food available, the population exploded. Ubaid settlements multiplied throughout Lower Mesopotamia like mushrooms after rain. Villages that previously housed a few dozen families grew to become towns of several thousand inhabitants. And here appears one of the most significant places in all of civilization's history: Eridu. Eridu was not simply another settlement. The ancient Sumerians, who would emerge millennia later, considered Eridu the first city created by the gods, the place where kingship descended from heaven for the first time. And although this mythological claim may seem fanciful, it contains a core of historical truth. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed a sequence of temples built one atop another, a stratigraphy that reaches back to the early Ubaid period. The oldest temple, a modest adobe structure with a small altar, dates approximately from the year 5300 before Christ. With each generation, the inhabitants of Eridu built a new temple over the ruins of the previous one, each larger and more elaborate than the precedent. What does this tell us? It reveals that already in the Ubaid period, there existed an organized religion, important enough for the community to invest enormous resources in the construction and maintenance of sacred buildings. Moreover, the continuity in the temple's location, rebuilt generation after generation in the same holy place, demonstrates a cultural memory that extended across centuries. Eridu was not just a place where people lived. It was a spiritual center, a focal point of communal identity that transcended individual lives. Social organization during the Ubaid period became considerably more complex. Excavations reveal houses of different sizes and construction qualities, suggesting the emergence of differences in status and wealth. Some individuals or families clearly controlled more resources than others. The temples, increasingly elaborate, required specialized artisans for their construction and maintenance: masons, carpenters, decorators. Pottery production became standardized, with forms and designs that repeated consistently, possibly indicating specialized workshops rather than individual domestic production. But all these changes, however significant they were, pale in comparison with the monumental transformation that was about to come. Around the year 4000 before Christ, Mesopotamia enters the Uruk period, named after the city that would become the largest and most powerful of the era. If we had to point to a specific moment when urban civilization is born, this would be that moment. If we had to identify the place where humanity definitively crosses the threshold between village and city, Uruk would be that place. To put the magnitude of Uruk in perspective, we need numbers. At its peak during the late Uruk period, approximately in the year 3200 before Christ, the city covered around 250 hectares and housed an estimated population between 40,000 and 50,000 inhabitants. Stop to consider these figures. We're talking about an urban concentration without precedent in human history. Nothing remotely comparable existed anywhere else on the planet. Egypt's largest city at that time had perhaps a tenth the size of Uruk. In Europe, the largest communities barely exceeded a few hundred inhabitants. What made sustaining such a human concentration possible? The answer lies in the increasingly sophisticated irrigation systems that extended throughout southern Mesopotamia. The canals were no longer simple, randomly dug ditches, but carefully planned networks that required constant maintenance, coordination between multiple communities, and a centralized authority capable of organizing collective labor. Water, the source of life in this arid land, also became a source of political power. The architecture of Uruk during this period reached levels of monumentality that literally touched the sky. In the center of the city rose the sacred precinct of Iana, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, and the Anu area, consecrated to the god of heaven. Here the first ziggurats were built, those stepped towers that would become the quintessential architectural symbol of Mesopotamia. The ziggurat was not simply a religious building, it was an artificial mountain, a bridge between earth and sky, between the human and the divine. Its construction required thousands of workers, tons of adobe, years of coordinated labor. Only a highly organized society, with abundant resources and centralized authority, could undertake such a project. But if we had to point to a single innovation of the Uruk period that changed the course of human history more than any other, it would be, without doubt, writing. Around the year 3200 before Christ, in the administrative offices of Uruk's temples, an anonymous scribe took a piece of moist clay and, with a reed stylus, pressed systematic marks on its surface. Those marks were not decorative. They were not art. They were coded information, symbols that represented words, numbers, concepts. For the first time in history, human thoughts could be stored outside the human brain. For the first time, knowledge could be transmitted through time without depending on the fragile memory of mortal individuals. The first Mesopotamian texts are not poetry or history. They are accounting records, lists of sheep, quantities of grain, beer deliveries. This may seem prosaic, but it is profoundly revealing. Writing did not arise from an abstract desire for artistic expression, but from a practical and concrete need. The need to administer the growing economic complexity of the first cities. The temples of Uruk functioned as economic redistribution centers, receiving tributes from surrounding communities and distributing rations to specialized workers. With thousands of transactions occurring constantly, human memory proved insufficient. A permanent recording system was needed. The initial symbols were pictograms, stylized drawings of the objects they represented. A circle with internal lines represented grain. A bull's head meant cattle. But quickly, these symbols evolved toward more abstract forms, pressed into the clay with wedge-shaped movements of the stylus. This technique, which modern scholars call cuneiform because of the wedge shape of the marks, would become the dominant writing system in the Near East for the next 3,000 years. Thousands of texts, hundreds of thousands of baked clay tablets that have survived to our days, preserving commercial contracts, personal letters, diplomatic treaties, religious hymns, literary epics. Without cuneiform writing, our knowledge of Mesopotamian civilizations would be fragmentary and speculative. With it, we can hear the voices of people who lived 5,000 years ago. We can read their thoughts, understand their concerns, know their names. Along with writing, the Uruk period witnessed other technological innovations that would permanently transform human civilization. The wheel, for example. Today it seems so obvious, so fundamental, that it's difficult to imagine a time before its invention. But for tens of thousands of years of human history, land transport depended exclusively on muscle power, humans and animals carrying weight directly on their backs. The wheel completely changed this equation. Suddenly, a single ox could drag loads that previously would have required dozens of men. Long-distance trade became viable. Cities could import construction materials, food, luxury goods from distant regions. Bronze metallurgy represents another technical revolution of the Uruk period. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was harder and more durable than the pure copper used previously. Bronze tools cut better, lasted longer, could be sharpened repeatedly. Bronze weapons conferred decisive military advantages. Bronze objects became symbols of status and wealth. But here a fascinating problem arises. Neither copper nor tin are found naturally in the Mesopotamian alluvial plain. Both metals had to be imported from distant mountainous regions, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. This drove the development of extensive and complex commercial networks. Mesopotamia exported its agricultural surpluses, textiles, and artisanal manufactures, and imported metals, wood, and stone. Long-distance trade was not a luxury, but an existential necessity for Mesopotamian urban civilization. The development of advanced mathematical systems during the Uruk period deserves special attention. The Mesopotamians invented a numerical system based on the number 60, the sexagesimal system. Why 60? The answer is lost in prehistory, but the choice proved extraordinarily fruitful. 60 has many divisors: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. This greatly facilitated calculations involving fractions and divisions. The Mesopotamians developed sophisticated mathematical tables, could perform complex multiplications and divisions, calculated areas and volumes, understood advanced geometric concepts. And here comes what's truly astonishing. We still use their sexagesimal system today. Every time we look at a clock and see 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, we are using a Mesopotamian invention from more than 5,000 years ago. Every time we measure angles in degrees, with 360 degrees in a circle, we are applying Mesopotamian mathematics. But let's return to the cities, because the urbanization of the Uruk period was not limited to Uruk itself. Throughout southern Mesopotamia, multiple urban centers emerged, each controlling the surrounding agricultural territory, each with its own monumental temples, its own political authorities. These were the first city-states, independent political units that competed and cooperated with each other, that traded and occasionally warred, that shared a common culture but maintained separate political identities. The social organization of these early city-states was hierarchical and complex. At the apex were the temples and their priests, who not only officiated religious ceremonies but controlled vast economic resources. The temples possessed extensive lands, flocks of thousands of animals, artisanal production workshops. They administered redistribution systems that employed hundreds of specialized workers. weavers, carpenters, brewers, bakers, metallurgists, a class of scribes educated in the complexities of cuneiform writing, maintained meticulous records of all transactions. Merchants organized expeditions to distant lands in search of exotic raw materials. Specialized artisans produced objects of extraordinary technical and artistic quality. And at the base of this social pyramid were the farmers, whose work in the irrigated fields fed all this complex urban machinery. Mesopotamian religion during this period was animistic and polytheistic, with a pantheon of gods that personified natural forces and abstract concepts. Anu was the god of heaven, the supreme divine authority. Enlil controlled the wind and storms, mediated between heaven and earth. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, patroness of Uruk, represented the contradictory passions of human existence. Enki, god of underground waters and wisdom, was humanity's benefactor, the one who had taught humans the arts of civilization. These gods were not distant and abstract entities. They inhabited the temples, consumed food offerings, participated in human affairs. Kings ruled as representatives of the gods on earth, their authority derived from divine mandate. The walls that surrounded the Mesopotamian cities of the late Uruk period deserve special mention. These were not simple wooden palisades or low stone walls. They were massive adobe fortifications, sometimes more than 10 meters high and several meters thick, extending along kilometers completely surrounding the urban zones. The construction of such walls required enormous resources. Millions of adobes manufactured, transported, and placed. Thousands of workers laboring for years. Impressive logistical organization. Why invest so much in defenses? The answer suggests that organized warfare was already a reality in the Uruk period. City-states competed for scarce resources, irrigable land, water from the canals, trade routes. This competition was sometimes resolved violently. While Uruk and other cities of Lower Mesopotamia flourished, significant developments also emerged in other regions. In Upper Mesopotamia, in what is now northern Iraq and Syria, communities that shared cultural elements with Uruk but maintained distinct identities established their own urban centers. In the eastern mountains, in what is now western Iran, complex societies emerged that would eventually form the kingdom of Elam, a power that would interact with Mesopotamia for millennia. To the west, on the coasts of the Mediterranean Levant, maritime cultures developed that would connect Mesopotamia with distant worlds. The cultural influence of the Uruk period extended far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia proper. Archaeologists have discovered Uruk-style artifacts, especially cylinder seals and characteristic ceramics, at sites scattered across hundreds of kilometers, from the mountains of Anatolia to the Indus Valley. Some scholars speak of an Uruk expansion, a period when merchants, settlers, or conquerors from Uruk established enclaves in distant regions. The exact nature of this expansion remains the subject of intense academic debate. Was it peaceful trade? Organized colonization? Military conquest? Probably. Different combinations of these factors in different regions. What is indisputable is that Uruk exercised a cultural and economic influence that extended across vast distances. The transition from the Uruk period to the early dynastic, around the year 3100 before Christ, conveniently marks the end of Mesopotamian prehistory and the beginning of history proper. From this moment, we have written texts extensive enough to reconstruct not only what occurred, but also who the individual actors were, what they thought, how they justified their actions. The names of individual kings begin to emerge from the mist of time. City-states develop more defined political identities. Wars between rival cities become more frequent and organized. But before abandoning the Uruk period, we must reflect on its profound significance. In the span of approximately 1,000 years, between 4,000 and 3,000 before Christ, Mesopotamian societies experienced transformations that would normally have required many millennia. The urban population grew exponentially. Social complexity multiplied. Revolutionary technologies emerged in rapid succession. completely new systems of political and economic organization developed. Why here? Why then? There is no simple answer. Academics have proposed numerous theories. Some emphasize environmental factors. The need to manage complex irrigation systems required centralized authorities. Others highlight demographic factors. Population growth created pressures that could only be resolved through more complex social organization. Some point to economic factors. Long-distance trade generated surpluses that financed artisanal specialization. Others argue religious factors. Temples acted as engines of social organization. The truth probably involves all these factors and more interacting in positive feedback loops. Population growth required more food, which drove improvements in irrigation, which allowed more population growth. Agricultural surpluses financed artisanal specialization, which improved technologies, which increased surpluses. Temples concentrated resources, which were invested in monumental projects, which reinforced the prestige of the temples. What is undeniable is that, by the end of the Uruk period, Mesopotamia had crossed a fundamental threshold in human experience. Mesopotamian societies were no longer enlarged agricultural villages. They were something qualitatively different. Complex urban civilizations, with cities of tens of thousands of inhabitants, with diversified and specialized economies, with elaborate social hierarchies, with sophisticated technologies, with writing systems, with organized religions, with monumental architecture, with refined art. They had invented, in essence, the prototype of all future civilizations. When we observe the characteristics that define an advanced civilization, practically all of them can be traced back to the Mesopotamia of the Uruk period. Large-scale urbanization, the first true cities in the world emerged here. Economic specialization, artisans dedicated exclusively to specific trades. Social stratification, elites that controlled disproportionate resources. Centralized government, authorities capable of mobilizing thousands of workers for collective projects. Writing systems, the ability to record and transmit information through time. Monumental architecture, constructions that expressed political and religious power. Long-distance trade, economic networks that connected distant regions. Advanced metallurgy, technologies that required specialized knowledge. Sophisticated mathematics, numerical systems capable of complex calculations. Organized religion, institutions dedicated to divine worship. Elaborate art, production of objects without immediate utilitarian function. All these characteristics appeared in Mesopotamia during the Neolithic period, and especially during the Uruk period. Some would emerge independently in other regions of the world in later millennia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, in Mesoamerica. But Mesopotamia was the first. Here, for the first time on our planet, scattered groups of sedentary farmers transformed into complex urban civilizations. Year 3000 before Christ. The walls of Uruk rise toward the sky like mountains fabricated by human hands. But something extraordinary is about to occur. In the temples, scribes no longer just record quantities of grain or heads of cattle. Now they write something completely different. They are writing names. Names of kings, names of heroes, names of gods. History is ceasing to be an anonymous process to become a drama starring specific individuals. And the protagonists of this drama carry a name that will resonate through the millennia. Sumerians. Who were the Sumerians? The question seems simple, but its answer has baffled scholars for generations. We don't know with certainty where they originally came from. Their language, Sumerian, is not related to any known language family. It is not Semitic like Akkadian or Hebrew. It is not Indo-European like Persian or Greek. It is a linguistic isolate, a language without known relatives, as unique as modern Basque in Europe. This has generated fascinating and sometimes fantastic speculations about their origins. Some propose they arrived as conquerors from distant lands. Others suggest they were the original inhabitants of the region, direct descendants of the Ubaid and Uruk cultures. Archaeological evidence shows no significant cultural rupture between the Uruk period and the early dynastic Sumerian period, which suggests population continuity rather than invasion or massive replacement. What we do know with certainty is that, after the year 3000 before Christ, the Sumerians dominated culturally and politically Lower Mesopotamia, the region they called Sumer, and their legacy would be absolutely monumental. Sumerian political organization was unique and, in many ways, remarkably modern in its conception. Unlike Egypt, which unified under a single pharaoh, creating an integrated territorial state, Sumer remained divided into multiple independent city-states. Each functioned as a completely autonomous political entity with its own government, its own laws, its own civic identity. Uruk, the largest and probably the oldest city, which would become one of the richest commercial centers of antiquity. Eridu, the sacred city where the gods had first descended according to Sumerian mythology. Lagash, which would produce some of the most detailed texts on state administration. Kish, whose royal title conferred special prestige. Amma, perennial rival of Lagash in territorial disputes that would last centuries. Nippur, religious center that housed the main temple of Enlil, father of the gods. These city-states were complete worlds in miniature. Imagine Uruk at its peak during the 3rd millennium before Christ. Massive adobe walls, reinforced with buttresses and watchtowers, completely surrounded the city, protecting a surface of more than 400 hectares in some periods. Crossing these walls meant passing through monumental gates, carefully guarded, where royal officials controlled the flow of people and goods. Once inside, the visitor would find themselves in a labyrinth of narrow streets flanked by adobe houses, some modest single-room dwellings where families of artisans or workers lived, others spacious multi-room residences with internal courtyards, homes of prosperous merchants or administrative officials. But what visually and symbolically dominated any Sumerian city was the ziggurat, that stepped tower that rose in the center of the sacred precinct. The ziggurat of Uruk, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, rose more than 30 meters above the surrounding plain, visible from kilometers away. It was not simply a building, it was a theological and political statement made architecture. At its summit was a small temple, where, according to Sumerian belief, the goddess descended to dwell among her people. The stairs that ascended its flanks were not just practical means of access. They represented the path between the earthly world and the divine realm, and only the highest-ranking priests could traverse that sacred path. The economy of these city-states absolutely depended on irrigation. Without the elaborate systems of canals that diverted water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the fields, most of Sumer would have been sterile desert. But managing these irrigation systems was extraordinarily complex. Canals had to be excavated, maintained, regularly cleaned of the silt that accumulated. The sluice gates that controlled water flow had to be operated coordinately. Disputes over water rights between different communities had to be resolved. All this required centralized authority, bureaucratic organization, the capacity to mobilize collective labor on a large scale. And here is where the temple played an absolutely central role in Sumerian society. Temples were not just places of worship. They were economic and political institutions of the first magnitude. They possessed vast extensions of agricultural land, worked by temple dependents who received food rations and other goods in exchange for their labor. They controlled flocks of thousands of sheep and goats that grazed on marginal lands outside the irrigated zones. They operated production workshops where specialized artisans manufactured textiles, metal objects, ceramics, products that the temple used internally or traded externally. The high priest, called En in Sumerian, was much more than a religious leader. He was the principal administrator of this vast economic enterprise, the mediator between the gods and humanity, and frequently the de facto political leader of the city-state. In the early Sumerian periods, the distinction between religious and secular authority was diffuse or non-existent. The supreme ruler derived his power from his relationship with the gods, from his capacity to interpret divine will, from his role as high priest who officiated the most important rituals. However, as the third millennium before Christ progressed, a new form of leadership gradually emerged. The Lugal, literally big man, which we could translate as king. Unlike the En, whose authority derived mainly from religious functions, the Lugal was fundamentally a military leader. In times of war, Sumerian city-states needed commanders capable of organizing armies, planning campaigns, making quick tactical decisions. Initially, the position of Lugal might have been temporary, designated only during military emergencies. But as war became more frequent and organized, these military leaders accumulated permanent power, eventually eclipsing the priests in political authority. Wars between Sumerian city-states were endemic and frequently brutal. Cuneiform tablets are filled with records of conflicts. Umma against Lagash for control of fertile border fields, Uruk against Ur for commercial supremacy, changing coalitions of cities allying against common rivals. These conflicts were not minor skirmishes. They involved armies of thousands of soldiers, prolonged sieges of fortified cities, systematic devastation of enemy agricultural fields. The Standard of Ur, a work of art discovered in the royal tombs of Ur, offers us a fascinating visual window into Sumerian warfare. In one of its panels, we see ordered rows of infantry soldiers marching in tight formation, protected by copper helmets and large rectangular shields. Spearmen advance in compact mass, their weapons projecting like a forest of deadly spikes. War chariots pulled by onagers, precursors to domesticated horses, trample fallen enemies. Naked prisoners are led before the victorious king. It is a sober and detailed representation of Sumerian military reality. But war was not the only engine of change in Sumer. Trade played an equally crucial role. Mesopotamia lacked many basic resources. It had no extensive forests to provide construction timber. It had practically no metal deposits. Both the copper and tin necessary to manufacture bronze had to be imported from distant mountainous regions. Building stone was scarce. Even apparently common materials like obsidian for cutting tools had to be brought from Anatolia or the mountains of Iran. This lack of natural resources forced the Sumerians to become extraordinarily active and sophisticated traders. Commercial expeditions traveled by land routes to the eastern mountains, where they exchanged textiles and agricultural products for copper, tin, lapis lazuli, and other precious materials. Merchants sailed through the Persian Gulf in reed boats, reaching the coasts of what is now Oman, where they obtained copper, and possibly traveling even farther to the Indus Valley, from where they imported ivory, carnelian, and exotic products. This long-distance trade was not simply exchange of goods, it was transfer of ideas, technologies, artistic styles. Sumerian cylinder seals, small stone cylinders engraved with elaborate scenes that were rolled over moist clay to leave an impression, appear at archaeological sites separated by thousands of kilometers. Mesopotamian architectural styles influenced constructions in the Levant and Anatolia. Cuneiform writing was adapted to write completely different languages, from Akkadian to Hittite. Sumer did not exist in isolation. It was the nucleus of a network of interactions that encompassed much of the known ancient world. Sumerian intellectual achievements deserve special attention because many of them continue to influence our daily lives millennia after Sumerian civilization disappeared. Consider mathematics. The Sumerians developed a sexagesimal numerical system based on the number 60 of extraordinary sophistication. But they didn't stop at basic arithmetic. They created multiplication tables that allowed quick calculations. They developed methods to calculate areas of irregular geometric figures, volumes of buildings, quantities of construction materials needed for architectural projects. They understood concepts like square roots and geometric progressions. Their astronomical knowledge was equally impressive. Sumerian priests meticulously observed the night sky from atop the ziggurats, recording the movement of planets, the phases of the moon, the appearance of specific stars at particular times of the year. This was not abstract curiosity. It had immediate, practical applications. Agriculture depended on knowing precisely when to plant and when to harvest. Religious festivals were linked to specific astronomical events. The Sumerian calendar was lunar, with months based on the cycles of the moon, but required periodic adjustments to stay aligned with the solar seasons. The Sumerians developed one of the first written legal systems of humanity. The Code of Ur-Nammu, promulgated by King Ur-Nammu of Ur approximately in the year 2100 before Christ, is the oldest legal code that has survived to our days. Although only fragments are preserved, they reveal a surprisingly sophisticated legal system. It established specific compensations for different offenses. If someone cut off another man's foot, they had to pay 10 shekels of silver. If they caused another man to lose a tooth, they paid 2 shekels. It was not the brutal principle of eye for eye that we sometimes imagine in ancient societies, but a system of restorative justice based on monetary compensations. But the Sumerian cultural achievement that has most captured modern imagination is undoubtedly the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest literary work of humanity. Gilgamesh was a semi-legendary king of Uruk, who probably ruled around the year 2700 before Christ. Stories about his feats were transmitted orally for centuries before finally being written on cuneiform tablets. The epic narrates the adventures of Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu, their journey to the cedar forests where they eliminated the monster Humbaba, the fight against the bull of heaven sent by the goddess Ishtar, and most movingly, Gilgamesh's desperate quest for immortality after Enkidu's passing. It is a story of friendship, power, pride, and finally, the acceptance of human mortality. When Gilgamesh finally finds Utnapishtim, the only human who has obtained eternal life, he hears the story of the Great Flood that destroyed humanity, an account that has evident parallels with the biblical story of Noah. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not just ancient entertainment, it explores deeply human themes that still resonate today. What is the purpose of life when we know we will pass away? What does it mean to be a good ruler? How do we deal with the loss of those we love? These questions are as relevant today as they were 4,500 years ago in the streets of Uruk. Sumerian religion was a complex system of beliefs and practices that permeated all aspects of life. The Sumerians conceived the universe as governed by hundreds of gods, each with specific domains. At the apex of the pantheon was An, god of heaven, distant and remote supreme authority. Enlil, god of air and storms, was more active in human affairs, frequently acting as executor of divine decisions. Enki, god of fresh underground waters, was humanity's benefactor, the one who had taught the arts of civilization, agriculture, writing, construction. Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, and war, was passionate and capricious, capable of both blessing and destroying. Each city had its patron deity. Uruk belonged to Inanna. Ur especially worshipped Nanna, the moon god. Eridu was the home of Enki. Nippur housed the main temple of Enlil, and for this reason had a special status as the religious center of all Sumer, although it was never a significant political or military power. Control of Nippur and its temple conferred religious legitimacy to any king who aspired to rules over multiple Sumerian cities. The Sumerians believed that humans had been created specifically to serve the gods, freeing them from the need to work. This was not a pessimistic vision. It was simply the fundamental structure of reality. In exchange for human service, the gods provided cosmic order, fertility of the land, protection against chaos. But Sumerian gods were not perfectly benevolent nor omniscient. They had personalities, emotions, rivalries. They could be deceived, offended, appeased. The relationship between humans and gods was almost contractual. Humans offered worship and offerings. The gods provided blessings and protection. Around the year 2334 before Christ, a transformative event shook the Sumerian world. A man named Sargon, whose name means legitimate king in Akkadian, conquered all the city-states of Sumer, unifying them under his personal rule. Sargon was not Sumerian. He spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. His origin is obscure and probably humble. Later legends claimed he had been found as an abandoned baby in a basket floating in the river, a narrative that evokes the biblical story of Moses. Sargon established his capital at Akkad, a city whose exact location archaeologists have not yet definitively identified, but which probably was located somewhere in the central region of Mesopotamia. From there, he built the first true empire in history, a territorial state that extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He was not content with ruling only Mesopotamia. He launched military expeditions to the Levant, Anatolia, and the mountains of Iran. Cuneiform inscriptions boast that his armies marched to the Cedar Forest in Lebanon and the Silver Mountains in Anatolia. The Akkadian Empire fundamentally transformed the political structure of Mesopotamia. Individual city-states lost their political independence, although they maintained cultural and religious importance. Akkadian, the Semitic language of the empire, gradually supplanted Sumerian as the administrative and diplomatic language, although Sumerian continued to be used in religious and literary contexts, similar to how Latin would function in medieval Europe. Sargon ruled for approximately 56 years, an extraordinary duration for the era, and was succeeded by his sons. His grandson, Naram-Sin, took the empire to its maximum extension and power. Naram-Sin adopted the unprecedented title of God of Akkad, declaring himself divine while still living, a level of arrogance that scandalized many contemporaries. He erected monumental stelae celebrating his military victories, like the famous stele of Naram-Sin that shows the king ascending a mountain, crushing enemies under his feet, with the stars of the gods shining above his crowned head. But the Akkadian Empire would not last. Around the year 2154 before Christ, approximately a century after its foundation, it collapsed with surprising rapidity. The causes are complex and debated. Invasions of mountain peoples called Gutians from the Zagros Mountains of the east, rebellions of Sumerian cities that never completely accepted Akkadian rule, and possibly, according to recent paleoclimatic evidence, a severe drought that lasted decades, devastating the irrigation agriculture on which the entire Mesopotamian economy depended. The Akkadian collapse plunged Mesopotamia into a period of political fragmentation and economic decline that later Sumerian texts describe in apocalyptic terms. But from this chaos eventually emerged a Sumerian renaissance, centered in the city of Ur. The third dynasty of Ur, which ruled approximately between 2112 and 2004 before Christ, represents the last period of Sumerian political domination in Mesopotamia. The dynasty's founder, Ur-Nammu, not only promulgated the legal code mentioned earlier, but also undertook monumental construction projects. The ziggurat of Ur, whose massive ruins still stand today in southern Iraq, was built during his reign. This three-level stepped structure, with a base of approximately 64 by 46 meters and an original height of more than 30 meters, represents one of the most impressive architectural achievements of antiquity. The kings of Ur III established an administrative system of astonishing, almost oppressive efficiency. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets from this period have survived, meticulously recording every aspect of the state economy. Records of workers assigned to specific projects, with their daily food rations calculated with precision. Inventories of sheep flocks, counting each animal individually. Deliveries of textiles to specific temples on precise dates. This extreme bureaucratization allowed the state to mobilize resources on unprecedented scales, but also created rigidity and vulnerability. The empire of Ur III extended from the Persian Gulf to the eastern mountains, controlling extensive trade routes. But its success contained the seeds of its destruction. Enormous expenses on construction projects, bureaucratic administration, and military expeditions strained the economy. Peripheral provinces began to rebel, and finally, around the year 2004 before Christ, coalitions of external enemies, particularly the Elamites from the eastern mountains and Semitic nomadic groups called Amorites from the west, destroyed the empire. The last king of Ur III, Ibisin, was captured and taken captive to Elam, a humiliating fate that would mark the end of Sumerian political power. With the fall of Ur III, Sumerian gradually disappeared as a spoken language, although it would continue to be used for more than 1,000 years in religious and literary contexts, similar to medieval Latin. The Akkadian-speaking Semitic populations, which had always been significant in northern Mesopotamia and had increasingly mixed with Sumerians in the south, became the dominant group culturally and linguistically. The next chapter of Mesopotamian history is dominated by Babylon, a city that during the Sumerian period had been relatively insignificant, but would ascend to become synonymous with splendor and power. Around the year 1894 before Christ, Babylon became the capital of an Amorite dynasty. These kings gradually expanded their control over neighboring cities, but it was the sixth king of the dynasty who would transform Babylon into an imperial power. Hammurabi ruled Babylon approximately between 1792 and 1750 before Christ. During his first decades on the throne, he concentrated on consolidating his control over the central region of Mesopotamia through a combination of astute diplomacy and selective warfare. But in the final years of his reign, he launched a series of brilliantly executed military campaigns that destroyed rival kingdoms and unified almost all of Mesopotamia under Babylonian authority. However, Hammurabi is remembered today not primarily for his military conquests, but for his legal code, the most famous juridical text of antiquity. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a black diorite stele of more than 2 meters in height, contains 282 laws that cover virtually all aspects of social, economic, and family life. Laws about commerce and debts, regulations about construction and professional liability, rules about marriage, divorce, and inheritance, punishments for different offenses. The code is famous for its principle of proportional justice, summarized in the phrase, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. If a builder constructs a house that collapses and causes the loss of its occupant, then the builder must face equivalent consequences. If a physician performs an operation that results in permanent harm, his hands may be removed. This principle may seem brutal to modern sensibilities, but it represented a significant advance over systems of arbitrary vengeance. It established limits. Punishment could not exceed the original offense. However, the code also reveals profound social inequalities. The laws explicitly distinguish between social classes: free nobles, common men, and slaves. An offense against a noble required greater compensation than the same offense against a common man. A slave had practically no legal rights. Women had some legal rights, particularly in matters of property and inheritance, but clearly occupied subordinate status. Hammurabi's empire did not survive long after the loss of its founder. His successors faced growing pressures from external enemies, particularly the Hittites from Anatolia and the Kassites from the Zagros Mountains. In 1595 before Christ, the Hittite king Mursili I launched a daring lightning attack that descended the Euphrates, sacked Babylon, and quickly withdrew carrying immense treasures. This attack devastated the Amorite dynasty, and in the ensuing chaos, the Kassites took control of Babylon, establishing a dynasty that would rule for more than 4 centuries. Meanwhile, in northern Mesopotamia, another power was ascending: Assyria. The Assyrians, inhabitants of the upper Tigris region around the city of Ashur, had existed as a political entity since very early periods, but for a long time remained in the shadow of larger southern powers. However, starting in the 14th century before Christ, Assyria began a systematic military expansion that would eventually convert it into the largest and most fearsome empire the ancient world had seen up to that moment. The Assyrians developed the most advanced military machinery of their time. Permanent professional armies replaced the temporary levies of peasants that characterized most ancient states. Mounted cavalry, using domesticated horses that had replaced the slower onagers, provided superior tactical mobility. Heavy war chariots, manned by archers and spearmen, broke enemy formations. Siege machines, mobile towers, and battering rams allowed the capture of heavily fortified cities that previously would have been impregnable. But the true Assyrian advantage was organizational and logistical. Assyrian kings established a road system that allowed rapid troop movement. They developed messaging systems that efficiently transmitted information and intelligence. They created strategically located supply depots that sustained campaigns in distant territories. They deported conquered populations, relocating them far from their native lands to prevent rebellions and provide labor for state projects. This military effectiveness came accompanied by calculated brutality. Assyrian royal inscriptions describe in disturbing detail the punishments inflicted on defeated enemies, entire cities razed, populations eliminated or enslaved, rebel leaders subjected to treatment we won't detail here. This cruelty was not random sadism. It was systematic terror designed to discourage resistance. The message was clear. Submitting to Assyria meant heavy tributes but survival. Resisting meant total destruction. At its peak during the 7th century before Christ, the Neo-Assyrian Empire extended from Egypt to the mountains of Iran, from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. It was the largest state the world had seen until then, administered through a sophisticated bureaucratic system centered in successive capitals: Ashur, Kalhu, and finally Nineveh. Nineveh, under King Sennacherib and his successor Ashurbanipal, became one of the most splendid cities of antiquity. Monumental palaces with walls decorated with elaborate reliefs showing military campaigns, royal hunts, and ceremonial processions, extensive gardens, possibly including the legendary Hanging Gardens that later tradition erroneously attributed to Babylon. And perhaps the most significant achievement, the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal. This library contained tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, literary texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, religious treatises, astronomical and mathematical texts, historical records, diplomatic correspondence. Ashurbanipal boasted of his education, claiming he could read tablets from ancient periods that even specialist scribes found difficult. The library represented a conscious effort to preserve the accumulated knowledge of 3 millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. But the Assyrian Empire, despite its apparently invincible power, would collapse with surprising rapidity. The factors were multiple: imperial overextension, with Assyrian garrisons scattered across vast territories defending impossibly long frontiers, rebellions of subjected peoples who coordinated their resistance, and, crucially, the emergence of new powers that challenged Assyrian supremacy. In 626 before Christ, Nabopolassar, governor of Babylon, rebelled against his Assyrian lords and established an independent dynasty. He formed an alliance with the Medes, an Iranian people who controlled regions of northern and eastern Iran. Together, Babylonians and Medes launched devastating attacks against the heart of Assyria. In 614 before Christ, they captured and destroyed Ashur. In 612 before Christ, Nineveh fell after a prolonged siege. The victors plundered the city so completely that centuries later, its exact location had been forgotten. Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 before Christ, converted Babylon into the most magnificent city of the ancient world. He undertook monumental construction projects that completely transformed the capital. The walls of Babylon, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, were so wide that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on them. The Ishtar Gate, decorated with brilliant blue glazed bricks and reliefs of dragons and bulls, gave access to the processional way that led to the Temple of Marduk. The ziggurat of Babylon, known as Etemenanki, House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, rose approximately 91 meters in height. This building was probably the inspiration for the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar II is also known for his military conquests. In 597 and again in 586 before Christ, he captured Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and deported the Jewish elite to Babylon in what is known as the Babylonian captivity, an event that would leave a deep mark on biblical tradition and Jewish identity. But the Neo-Babylonian Empire would last less than a century. In 539 before Christ, Cyrus the Great of Persia, having unified the Iranian tribes and conquered the Median Empire, directed his attention toward Babylon. Sources differ on the precise details of the conquest, but it seems that Babylon fell with relatively little resistance. Cyrus entered the city as a liberator rather than as a conqueror, presenting himself as a restorer of the traditional order disturbed by the last Babylonian king. The Persian conquest marks a convenient turning point in Mesopotamian history. Mesopotamia would never recover its political independence. It would be ruled successively by Persians, Macedonians under Alexander the Great, and his Seleucid successors, Parthians, and finally Sasanians. Mesopotamian languages, Akkadian and Sumerian, would gradually disappear, replaced first by Aramaic and eventually by Arabic after the Islamic conquest in the 7th century of our era. However, to affirm that Mesopotamia passed away in 539 before Christ would be profoundly misleading. Politically, yes, the native civilizations of Mesopotamia had lost their independence, but culturally, their legacy not only survived, it expanded and transformed the entire world. Consider writing. The cuneiform system invented in Uruk more than 5,000 years ago was adapted to write dozens of different languages across 3 millennia. When it finally stopped being used around the 1st century of our era, the fundamental principles of writing it had already spread globally. Every modern writing system, from the Latin alphabet you're reading now to Chinese characters, descends conceptually from those first Sumerian scribes who pressed marks into moist clay. Mesopotamian astronomy was transmitted to the Greeks, who refined it and integrated it into their natural philosophy. Greek astronomers like Hipparchus used Babylonian observations of eclipses that reached back centuries. The zodiac constellations we use today are largely of Mesopotamian origin. The names of the days of the week in many European languages derive from planets identified by Mesopotamian astronomers. Mesopotamian mathematics, especially the sexagesimal system, continues to govern our measurement of time: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. All these are direct inheritances from Sumer and Babylon. Legal concepts developed in codes like Hammurabi's influenced later legal systems. The very idea that laws should be written, public, and applied consistently, rather than being capricious and arbitrary, is a Mesopotamian innovation. Mesopotamian religious narratives permeated later traditions in sometimes surprising ways. The flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh shares notable parallels with the biblical account of Noah. The creation of humans from clay, the divine garden, the serpent associated with wisdom or deception. These motifs appear first in Mesopotamian texts and later resurface in the Hebrew Bible. The very concept of the city as a fundamental form of civilized organization is a Mesopotamian inheritance. The city-states of Sumer established a model that would be repeated in Greece, Rome, and eventually throughout the world. More than 3,000 years separated the first Ubaid settlements from the Persian conquest. During this vast period, Mesopotamia witnessed the rise and fall of cities, dynasties, empires. It experienced revolutionary technological innovations and fundamental cultural developments. It was home to some of the most notable individuals of antiquity: Gilgamesh, whose feats became legend; Sargon, the first empire builder; Hammurabi, the lawgiver; Nebuchadnezzar, the builder of marvels. And throughout all these changes, all these transformations, common people lived their lives. Farmers working fields under the scorching sun, artisans perfecting their trades in urban workshops, merchants traveling dangerous routes in search of profit, scribes copying ancient texts in temple chambers, priests officiating rituals that connected the human with the divine. Their individual names were rarely recorded. Their individual lives did not move empires, but collectively, across generations, they built something extraordinary: civilization itself. When nomads stopped beside the Tigris and Euphrates rivers more than 8,000 years ago and planted the first seeds, they could not imagine the consequences of their actions. They could not foresee the monumental cities that would grow on these plains, the legal codes that would be written, the epics that would be composed, the empires that would rise and fall. They didn't know they were initiating a revolution that would fundamentally transform human experience. They didn't know that between two rivers they were inventing the future. But they did.